The whispers. In the walls, Jason moved into an old creaky house. That night, he heard faint whispers from the walls. "Help! Us!" they begged. Startled, he pressed his ear to the wall as handprints began appearing, pressing out from the inside. Panicked, Jason smashed the wall open, but found only empty space. A cold breath grazed his neck. "Now you're trapped too," a voice whispered. Jason turned, but it was too late. The wall sealed shut, and his voice joined the whispers forever. Part 2. The Legend of the Wraith. The next morning, Claire decided to visit the town library in hopes of finding some information about the McAllister house and the strange man she had seen in the woods. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove, eyed her warily as she approached the desk. "What can I do for you?" Mrs. Hargrove asked, her voice gruff and unfriendly. "I'm looking for information about the McAllister house," Claire replied, "and about any local legends or stories that might explain strange occurrences." Mrs. Hargrove's expression darkened at the mention of the house. She leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing, as she whispered, "You'd do well to leave that place, dear. Nothing good ever came from meddling in the past." "But why?" Claire pressed. "What happened there?" The librarian hesitated, glancing around the empty library before speaking in a low voice. "They say the McAllister house is cursed, that anyone who lives there is doomed to meet a terrible fate. The man you saw in the woods. That's the Wraith of Hollow Creek. He was once a man like any other, but his greed and cruelty turned him into something else, something evil." Claire listened intently as Mrs. Hargrove recounted the tale. Many years ago, the McAllister family was one of the wealthiest in town. They owned most of the land and had more money than they knew what to do with. But their wealth came at a cost. The head of the family, Silas McAllister, was a cruel and ruthless man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He cheated, stole, and even killed to amass his fortune, and he cared little for the lives he destroyed in the process. One day, a group of townsfolk decided they had had enough. They banded together and confronted Silas, demanding that he return what he had stolen and leave Hollow Creek for good. But Silas refused. In a fit of rage, he cursed the town, swearing that he would have his revenge on anyone who dared to cross him. The townsfolk were terrified, but they knew they had to stop Silas before he could do any more harm, so they lured him into the woods and set a trap, intending to kill him and bury his body where no one would ever find it. But something went wrong. Silas didn't die like a normal man. Instead, his spirit became twisted and corrupted, turning him into the Wraith, a vengeful ghost that haunts the woods to this day, seeking to exact his revenge on anyone who dares to live in his house. Claire's heart raced as she listened to the story. "And you think he's after me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Hargrove nodded solemnly. "The Wraith has claimed many lives over the years. If you stay in that house, you'll be next." But Claire wasn't ready to give up so easily. She had come to Hollow Creek for a fresh start, and she wasn't about to let some ghost story scare her away. "Thank you for the warning," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I need to know more. Is there any way to stop him?" The librarian hesitated again before sighing heavily. "There might be. They say the Wraith can only be banished if the wrongs committed by Silas McAllister are righted, if the things he stole are returned to their rightful owners, and if his victims are given justice. But that's no easy task, especially after all these years." Claire nodded, determination setting in. "I'll find a way," she said. "I have to." Mrs. Hargrove shook her head sadly. Be careful, dear. The wraith is not to be trifled with. Chup Part 3. The Search for Answers. Over the next few days, Claire threw herself into researching the history of the McAllister family and the town of Hollow Creek. She spent hours poring over old newspapers, letters, and town records, piecing together the dark past that had been buried for so long. She discovered that Silas McAllister had indeed been a tyrant, using his wealth and power to oppress the townsfolk and take whatever he wanted. But as she dug deeper, she also found evidence that the curse might be more than just a legend. There were reports of strange occurrences at the McAllister house dating back decades, sightings of the wraith, mysterious deaths, and unexplained accidents. The more she learned, the more she realized how dangerous her situation was. But instead of scaring her off, it only made her more determined to stop the wraith and end the curse, once and for all. One evening, as she was going through a box of old letters she had found in the attic, she came across one that caught her attention. It was addressed to Silas McAllister and written by a woman named Margaret, who claimed to be one of his victims. In the letter, she begged Silas to return a locket that he had stolen from her, a locket that had belonged to her mother and was the only thing she had left to remember her by. Claire's heart ached as she read Margaret's desperate plea. She knew she had to find that locket and return it to its rightful owner, even if it meant facing the wraith herself. That night, she dreamt of the man in the woods again, but this time, instead of feeling fear, she felt a strange sense of purpose. In the dream, the man led her to a hidden compartment in the floor of the McAllister house, where the locket lay buried beneath layers of dust and grime. When she awoke, she immediately set to work, searching the house for any sign of the hidden compartment. Hours passed with no luck, and she began to fear that the dream had been nothing more than a figment of her imagination. But just as she was about to give up, she noticed something odd about the floorboards in the living room. One of them was slightly raised, as if it had been tampered with. Heart pounding, she pried it open and found a small, dusty box hidden inside. Inside the box was the locket, tarnished and worn, but still intact. Claire held it in her hand, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over her. She had found it, the first step in righting the wrongs of the past. But as she stood up, she felt a cold breeze brush against her neck, and a low, menacing growl echoed through the room. She turned slowly, her heart racing, and saw the wraith standing in the doorway, his eyes glowing with fury. "You dare to defy me," he hissed, his voice filled with malice. Claire clutched the locket tightly, refusing to back down. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "I'm going to end this curse, once and for all." The wraith's twisted grin returned, but there was no warmth in it, only cold, cruel amusement. "We'll see about that," he sneered before vanishing into the shadows. Part 4. The Confrontation. With the locket in hand, Claire knew she had to act quickly. She made her way to the town cemetery, where Margaret had been buried all those years ago. The cemetery was old and overgrown, the tombstones weathered and covered in moss. But after some searching, she finally found Margaret's grave. Before the grave, Claire placed the locket on the ground and whispered a prayer with soul. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and she felt a presence watching her. But she did not know. As she finished her prayer, a sudden gust of wind whipped her. The locket was only closed and faint, filled with light. Claire enveloped in the grave, soft the earth. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving only silence. Had it worked? Had she finally broken the curse? Her hopes were dashed when she heard the familiar, bone-chilling wail of the wraith echoing through the cemetery. She turned and saw him standing at the edge of the graveyard, his eyes burning with rage. "You think you can stop me?" he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing. You cannot undo what has been done." But Claire refused to be intimidated. "I'm not trying to undo the past," she said, her voice steady. "I'm trying to make it right." With that, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the box she had found in the McAllister house. Inside, along with the locket, was a bundle of old letters written by Silas McAllister to his victims, confessing to his crimes and begging for their forgiveness. "I found these in your house," Claire said, holding the letters up for the wraith to see. "You may have been a monster in life, but even you knew what you did was wrong. It's time to let go. It's time to move on." For a moment, the wraith seemed to falter, his form flickering like a candle in the wind. But then his eyes hardened, and his twisted grin returned. "You think you've won?" he sneered. "You think a few old letters can erase the sins of the past? You are a fool." With a wave of his hand, the ground beneath Claire's feet began to shake, and the tombstones around her shattered into pieces. She stumbled back, her heart racing with fear, but she didn't let go of the letters. "I don't care what you say," she shouted over the roar of the shaking earth. "I know the truth. You're not a monster. You're just a man who made terrible choices, and now it's time to pay for them." The wraith let out a furious scream, and the ground beneath Claire's feet gave way, sending her tumbling into a dark, bottomless pit. But as she fell, she held on to the letters, refusing to let them go. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped, and the darkness around her faded away. Claire found herself standing in a beautiful sunlit meadow, surrounded by flowers and trees. The air was warm and fragrant, and the sound of birds singing filled the air. In front of her stood a man who looked just like the wraith, but without the twisted, malevolent grin. His eyes were soft and kind, and his face was filled with sorrow. "Thank you," he said, his voice gentle. "Thank you for freeing me." Claire nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry for what happened to you," she said, "but it's over now. You can rest in peace." The man smiled sadly before turning and walking away, disappearing into the trees. Claire watched him go, her heart filled with a strange mixture of sadness and relief. She knew she had done the right thing. The curse had been broken, and the wraith of Hollow Creek was no more. Part 5. The Aftermath. When Claire returned to Hollow Creek, she was met with a mix of reactions. Some of the townsfolk were relieved, grateful that the curse had finally been lifted. Others were skeptical, unwilling to believe that the wraith was truly gone. But Claire didn't care what they thought. She knew the truth, and that was all that mattered. In the weeks that followed, she continued to restore the McAllister house, turning it into a beautiful, welcoming home. She even began to make friends in the town, earning the respect and admiration of those who had once been wary of her. But despite the peace she had found, there was still a part of her that couldn't forget the wraith and the horrors she had faced. The memory of that night in the cemetery haunted her dreams, and she often found herself waking in a cold sweat, her heart pounding with fear. One night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she heard a faint whisper in the darkness. At first she thought it was just her imagination, but then she heard it again, a soft, gentle voice calling her name. She sat up, her heart racing. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Thank you," it said. "Thank you for setting me free." Claire's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the voice. It was the Wraith, or rather, the man he had once been. For a moment, she felt a surge of fear, but then she remembered the meadow and the kindness in his eyes. The fear melted away, replaced by a deep sense of peace. "You're welcome," she whispered back, a small smile on her lips. The whisper faded away, and the room fell silent once more. Claire lay back down, her heart finally at ease. She knew that the Wraith was gone for good, and that she had done the right thing. The curse had been broken, and the town of Hollow Creek was free at last. And as she drifted off to sleep, she knew that she would never forget the man who had once been a monster, but who had finally found peace.